I think growing up in Wales, it was always the case that rugby would be crossing my path sooner or later. And as with actually many of the Welsh players I spoke to, I was drawn into the sport because my older brother was playing. But once I started playing, the reasons that I loved it are really still the same reasons that I love watching it now. And I think that's because of the scope of the game. In so many sports, an athlete or a sports person is expected perhaps to be really good at one thing, maybe two or three. But rugby asks all 15 men to do so many different things, from the brute physicality of the tackle and running into a tackle to the finesse and the skill of the kicking and the passing. As a spectator, it also offers you that same incredible variety of pacing. There's much slower moments now of the set pieces, of the scrum and the line out, which for me, especially now I've spent some time obviously speaking to international level forwards, I see the line out in this completely different way. It's like a moment of orchestrated ballet, and then from there suddenly the game will fire and you're into this much, much faster pace. And I guess as a writer, it feels to me to be especially strong in terms of narrative. It's such an obviously territorial game. Spectators tend to know a lot about the players on the pitch and the teams coming onto the pitch. There are always stories feeding into each individual game. And in Wales, those stories are also about stories of community and place. That's why rugby became such a strong sport in Wales. It really spoke to a sense of community and identity. And so as well as everything you're getting on the pitch, I think it tends to be a sport with a really rich hinterland of story as well. I came to write Calon because I was asked to be the artist in residence for the Welsh Rugby Union, which was a very unusual position. I don't think that any international rugby side had tried it before. But the idea was, and the idea grew, from this concept that traditionally the culture of arts and the culture of sport in Wales had always been very close cousins, partly because they came from the same place, from the industrialised South Wales valleys. Since the game of rugby became pro, it was felt that the two cultures were beginning to separate and diverge. So the Welsh Rugby Union, I think, in a really brilliant way, sat down with the Welsh Arts Council and said, what can we do to try and bring the cultures back together? So this idea was born of being the artist in residence. I was very lucky in that they asked me to be the first artist in residence. It took me about 7 seconds to say yes. I'd grown up as a huge supporter of the Welsh rugby team. I still am. I used to play rugby. But as a writer, I think it offered an opportunity which I always think is fascinating, and if it crosses your path, you have to grab it, which is the opportunity to have a privileged witness inside an environment which perhaps for most of us remains quite distant. Sport can be an anonymising force. They become players and coaches and stop being people. So I saw this opportunity to get under the skin of the sport, to really try and tell the story of international rugby from a player's and a coach's perspective. A lot of the players are young boys who are plucked from quite remote villages, small towns, and suddenly put onto the world stage. And that's a huge weight to bear psychologically, emotionally. So it's a human story as well as a sports story, as well as being a story about Wales. I mean, I would like to think that any rugby fan and any sports fan will get something from it. And of course, I guess the other thing that drew me to this was the opportunity to provide something for the fans as well. Some insights into the game, into the people who play the game and why they play it and the stresses of it that they wouldn't perhaps have found elsewhere. I think at first the players thought it was slightly unusual to have this little writer guy kind of hanging out at their training sessions in the gym, on the team bus with them. But actually they very quickly embraced the idea, and I think it was for two reasons. One was because they really trust their coaches, and in the case of Wales, they really trust Warren Gatlin. So they basically thought, if Warren says it's okay for Owen to be here, it's okay for him to be there. The other reason was I realised that for the first 6 months, really, my job was to listen, to observe, to be there. I didn't ask really any questions in those first few months. And that was partly because I wanted to soak up the atmosphere, to learn the world, to learn the vocabulary, the idiolect, the rhythms of that world, but also to show that I wasn't just going to turn up on international days and have those sort of glory moments, that I was going to be there at 8 in the morning on the training pitch. But I'm really thrilled with the way that they embraced it, and I think that they understood that I wanted to try to give their point of view, and they embraced it to the extent that very quickly they came to regard having a writer or a piece of writing in a matchday programme as something you just have. So across the Six Nations for 2012, I had a poem or a piece of writing in all of those matchday programmes. And very soon some of the players came to me asking if I could write a piece for the programme for their testimonial match. I was surprised by how quickly they thought, okay, we've got the physio, we've got the sports analyst, we've got our writer. And I sort of became, just for that period, I became part of the squad and felt very, very lucky because of that.